Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turn renewable energy engineers, talk veteran issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
It's good to see you, Pearson. Hope your harvest moon is abundant.
I don't know what that means, but I do hope that as well. Today is episode 26, and I think we're going to end up talking about really get back into our globalization series, despite our best efforts to not get back into it last episode. So, but first, let's hit some good news in this doom and gloom world that we live in, where the news cycle is dominated by the doom and gloom. It's nice to have a good news story that kind of cheers up our day first. So, what do you got for us today, Richard?
All right. Well, what do you know about how refrigeration works?
I know what someone who's taken an HVAC class knows, and less than an HVAC technician.
So, there's a couple of different things that are being pumped and moved around, and there's these cycles of expansion and contraction.
Absolutely.
For you ideal gas law nerds out there, we've got PIV nerds. Our story today comes from Science Daily. Eco-friendly cooling device with record-breaking efficiency. Researchers have developed an eco-friendly refrigeration device with record-breaking cooling performance, setting to transform industry's reliance on cooling and to reduce global energy use. With a boost in efficiency over 48%, the new elastocaloric.
Ooh, okay.
That's better than interpants on the interwebs. Elastocaloric cooling technology opens a promising avenue for accelerating the commercialization of this disruptive technology. It addresses environmental challenges associated with traditional cooling systems. Okay. So I'm going to not read the entire article, but let's get into the slugline. Traditional vapor compression refrigeration technology relies on refrigerants of high global warming potential. Solid-state elastocaloric refrigeration based on latent heat in the cyclic phase transition of shape memory alloys.
Oof. This article is not pulling any punches.
So I think we could probably do an entire program and maybe a series of programs on shape memory alloys, but these are the metals that you can distort and change, but they will recover back their original shapes.
Okay.
So imagine a paperclip, like, let's say you're sitting in a really engaging company meeting and you've got a paperclip in your hand, and by the time you're done, you've destroyed it entirely. It's no longer a paperclip. But if it was made of the shape memory alloys, it would it's not magic, it's metallurgy. It would find its way back into that original paperclip shape.
Yeah.
And that's because of the way that the alloy is structured. Those bends have to return back to the shape that they were originally before you made this thing into the shape of a scimitar.
Sounds like the elasticity has some specific properties within this material.
Yeah. So what's interesting, and this this article might be a little bit different from what I'm about to mention, but one of the things that's interesting about metallurgy is that if you take certain types of soft metals, I mean, we're working on human strength here to bend them, so you want it to be soft. But if you start flexing or articulating metal, at the point at which it's bending, it will heat up. So you get a thermal delta at that point where all that friction is happening. Well, even though this first line of this first paragraph in this article gets a little hairy right off the bat, talking about vapor compression refrigeration technology, that's just how your refrigerator works.
Yeah.
You live with it all the time. It's not that exciting anymore. I mean, in the 20th century, it's super exciting. What this does is it starts getting at how materials would behave when they have this shape memory alloy construction. All right. So So I'm going to find my place here. Solid state elastocaloric refrigeration based on latent heat in the cyclic phase transition of shape memory alloys provides an environmentally friendly alternative with its characteristics of greenhouse gas free, 100% recyclable, and energy efficient SMA refrigerants. But the relatively small temperature lift between 20 and 50 Kelvin,
Okay.
which is a critical performance indicator of the cooling device's ability to transfer heat from a low temperature source to a high temperature sink, has hindered the commercialization of this emerging technology. And so, what these researchers have done is come up with a way to really put that into use, because I think we've mentioned in the past, we have these cool news stories about a cool new technology, and it sounds like it's going to totally change the world. Usually it's the implementation details of those technologies that holds it back. It doesn't scale very well, or it's hard to put into a, you can fabricate it in the lab, but it's really hard to manufacture it because of all these stabilizing elements that the laboratory has that industry is expensive to sustain. So anyway, we just observed how I was able to get through a polysyllabic word filled paragraph.
Yeah.
My first grade reading teacher would be proud of me.
You did it. Polysyllable. Were you trying to? Was it?
Yeah, polysyllabic is the multi-syllable words.
There we go. Yeah, that was a mouthful.
Anyway, so what we can look forward to in the future is a change in the way that we think of refrigeration from a system where there's a compressor and an evaporator, that's the vapor-related refrigeration cycle, to something that uses these memory materials.
Yeah, so well, it sounds like they can do away with the refrigerant aspect of the refrigerator, which
Bingo. That's the problem.
Yeah, and to remind our listeners, they might not be familiar with this, but CFCs were the specific refrigerant that was extremely popular in the 70s, 60s and 70s, I believe. And refrigerators and other HVAC technologies use different types of coolants, or CFCs. And these are highly damaging chemicals that would attack the ozone, or O3 layer, protecting our Earth from electromagnetic radiation. So the hole in the ozone was due to CFCs being released mainly, and our whole globe came together to agree to ban CFCs in a miraculous turn of like unity and agreement across the globe. We were able to ban CFCs, and then the hole apparently repaired itself.
Fluorocarbons.
Yes,
That's what a CFC is. Are non-toxic, non-flammable chemicals containing atoms of carbon, chlorine, and fluorine. Non-toxic, non-flammable chemicals. So when you compare those, it says the article I'm looking at from NOAA.gov, refrigerators in the late 1800s and early 1900s used the toxic gases ammonia, methyl chloride, and sulfur dioxide as refrigerants. After a series of fatal accidents in the 1920s, when methyl chloride leaked out of refrigerators, a search for less toxic replacement began. As a collaborative effort of three American corporations, Frigidaire, General Motors, and DuPont, CFCs were first synthesized in 1928. So the 1920s were when the amazing replacement for super toxic, deadly gases that we use for refrigeration that was when they were first synthesized. They were replaced later in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
And we lived in this glorious new world where this magical new chemical compound was no longer a lethal refrigerant. Except one small problem. When it leaked, it had this negative impact on the ozone layer of our Earth's atmosphere. causing a brand new problem. So
Yeah.
engineering is always about solving one problem and spawning two more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and sulfur dioxide, I believe, was also, isn't that also a greenhouse gas?
Um, the current thing that we're using for refrigeration is I think it's either propane or it's one of those like those molecules that you get from petroleum that's adjacent to propane. I'm forgetting
Yeah.
what the chemical combination is, but propane is a refrigerant because of its um, I'm forgetting exactly how the adiabatic cycle goes, but it when you compress it
It
let's
has a
see
low
it
boil point when it's
yeah
compressed, I believe. If I mean, I'm totally butchering this because
yeah
it's been a while since I've taken thermal. So
stay in school, kids.
I'm gonna
Drink
have
your
to go
milk.
back and look at heat transfer 1 or 2 through my notes
Right.
and refresh myself on this. But yes, it's something to do with the boil point under pressure, typically.
Well, I mentioned Pivnert earlier, and only the ideal gas nerds got what that was, but that's pressure and volume in an
Equals.
equation with molecules of gas, and the constant R and the temperature in Kelvin, I believe. So there's an equation where pressure and volume are these operative terms in that equation, and if you change one, you get a change in the other things.
Yeah.
So creating smaller volume and higher pressure will change your temperature if you're the amount of gas and
Isn't that the
its
ideal gas
consistency.
equation is what that is?
Yeah.
PV equals NR, and sometimes
Yep.
there's it's over M or some other hidden
Mm-hmm.
variables that you can cancel out for depending on,
Yeah.
which equation you're actually solving for. But yes, um,
If you want to see it in action, let's see, you can take your aluminum water bottle that is it has a pH of 8. The water is advertised as being alkaline. Take that aluminum bottle, heat it up, close the cap, and then put it in a refrigerator. It will crush itself, and that that crushing action is a consequence of the uh, atoms of the atmosphere that were inside of it, the H2O atoms, if you left a little water in there and got it hot, when those condense, it shrinks the volume that the container can
contain.
displace.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that when that volume shrinks, the container will crush. And the reason I'm picking on that particular water bottle is because that's the one I use in the lab when I demonstrate this property.
Nice. I was about to say, I was like, I was thinking of the liquid death cans or whatever, those cans of water or whatever.
I don't think it's sealed quite as nice as those alkaline 8, pH of 8 alkaline water bottles do.
Yeah, I don't know if they do either. I've never had any of the liquid death water. Something about drinking water out of a can seems not ideal to me. But
I selected one of those one time. It's aluminum can, right? It seals, and I keep it around and I drink out of it all the time. I bought it once and I use it over and over again. It's a canteen to me.
yeah,
And our professor who teaches anatomy and physiology saw me drinking it, and he gave me a lecture on how the human body has a buffering system for alkaline acidic materials that you put into it. And he goes, that's a joke, right? I go, yeah, I bought it because I like the canteen aspect of this water bottle I got to reuse over again, but you're absolutely right. And so it turns out that it's a perfectly harmless scam that we tell the American public that if they drink this alkaline water, there's some health benefit to it. No, biology changes it. Our biology does not let an alkaline material go into us and change us at all. Fun
damn,
stuff.
tricked those marketers out there just manipulating the scientific
and,
rube language.
and enjoy. I hope you enjoy the aluminum bottle that it comes in, and also you can do a science experiment with it.
Yeah. Well,
all right. So, should we get on to our topic?
Yeah, let's do it. So,
all right. I have a question for you.
Let's go. Shoot.
What possible things could have happened in the early 20th century that would have caused a second Great War?
Well, It turns out there was a couple factors, and some people like to argue that it could have started with the Brits going off of their standard in 1921. I believe they were the sterling was backed by silver, or was it backed by gold? I mean, it was called the sterling, but was it backed by silver or gold,
Hold
or a
on, let me look it
combination
up
of
here.
both?
Let me look it up here. You go ahead and keep on going with that litany of reasons.
So this was one, and then the U.S. also, so another Western country, was going through a huge credit bubble, which popped in 1929, I believe, is when the credit bubble popped. And this was due to the fact that credit and lending had really gotten out of hand for the first time in America. And the stock market, people were buying stocks on credit. So basically, um, and this led to a Great Depression, and which also coincided with uh, a huge famine event in the U.S. So these were two confluent factors within the U.S. that led to some things. This caused the U.S. to kind of turn inward, very populist, to deal with some problems, which I would argue was a contributing factor to World War II. More locally to Germany, Germany was having economic woes of its own, but arguably it was kind of pulling itself out of the depression that it had gone into after World War One. By the turn of like 1929, about the time we were going into a depression, they were actually pulling themselves out. But things still weren't economically stable there, so people were still pretty upset and unhappy with the way things were going.
I found this
Yeah,
webpage,
go ahead.
bound.co. This is a blog. And in under the heading, The Value of a British Pound Today, in terms of exchange value, the British pound is essentially nominal. £1 sterling is equal to 100 pence, and they break this down. The pound is still a gold-backed currency, at least nominally. It's a tiny currency in circulation backed by gold. So I'm sure that there's depth there to that. I'm not sure if I totally get what that means, but for all intents and purposes, this web blog says that it's a gold backed currency.
So it said it still is. So we can then, I guess, assume that the sterling was backed by gold until it was completely backed by gold, and then after the change in 1921, it sounds like it was nominally backed by gold. And I don't know enough about finances to necessarily know or understand that, but we can just understand that they had de-dollarized, they had de-backed their currency, and so there was a lot of factors that probably led to World War II. At the same time, we can say that the Japanese were expanding their empire in Southeast Asia at the time. Both, and then at the end of the day, both Germany and Japan understood they needed oil, or they were going to be left behind. This would be the Daniel Jurgen argument here, and his narrative from The Prize, which is not an insignificant point that he was making. So strategically, oil, everyone after World War One knew they needed oil. Like that, they needed access. It became a national security issue, was having oil. So I would say, just off the top of my head, these are the things that I'm thinking about for major reasons of why World War II happened.
What were the significant changes to European civilization in terms of how governments were structured? Do you recall the formation of new types of governments that led to World War II?
Oh, no, this would be a blank spot for me. You'd have to fill in the gaps here.
So one of the significant features of the early 20th century is that people were experimenting with new ways to operate a civilization. And World War I caused the breakup of several empires. And following the breakup of those empires, we tried out new things called communism. We've spoken at length
Oh
about
yes, yeah,
the transition from Tsar Nicholas's empire in Russia to the Soviet Republic that emerged from the 1920s.
yes.
And there are two, there are two other nations, but there's another significant type of autocratic system of government that emerged.
I see where you're leading to. The Italians and fascism, fascio, the
Mhm.
the authors of fascism, which is the
Yes.
Italians. Mussolini specifically contracted this authoritarian or autocratic ruling system or ideology, I guess. He contracted people to write this, to write about
Yeah.
fascism.
So this is there's interesting stories that I think we'll touch on lightly here, but if you really want to get into this, part of what part of where fascism its origin, part of where fascism comes from is the fear that communism put into Europeans as a as Europe watched Russia devolve into this madhouse place that was in turmoil and civil wars, and that the autocrat was deposed. This Tsar Nicholas was one of the grandchildren of Queen Victoria, as was the autocrat in Germany.
Wilhelm.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And the king in England. So this royal family that was a part of these European diplomacy and essentially the treaties that Europeans kept with each other, the countries that kept with each other, when that devolved and fell apart at the end of World War I, these new systems of government were coming into place, and fascism in part came into existence to oppose the growth and spread of communism, because communism was such an appalling attack on these traditional ways of life, and in particular the way that the Russians had gone about doing it. It was bad. It was destructive. It caused famines. It was dysregulating to all these different systems that could have been maybe propped up or kept in place, but it eradicated them, and that put a lot of fear into Europeans in the West. And so we saw this growth of this new what we would in our civilization, we think of the right wing as being conservative and being connected with this way of governing called fascism. And what fascism is it's one part autocratic. That is what ultimately emerges from it, the same way that communism does.
Yeah.
But it is a different way of structuring the private industry and private markets. It's still being directed from a central authority figure, but it's being done in a capitalist approach as opposed to a collectivist communist approach. And that's the super oversimplified version of all of this. But that fascism emerged first, or at least in the way that we're describing this history, in Italy, which was a relatively new formation for the part of Europe that had been where the seat of the Roman Empire. Italy is kind of a new thing at this point in history, and fascism ultimately deposed the autocrat that was in rule in Italy.
Yeah, the funny thing is, when I was learning about fascism, the idea that it never really just didn't take in Italy, and the argument was because there's an idealistic aspect of fascism which had a lot of overlap actually with communism, and it was the idea of sacrificing the individual for the greater good. Now, the differences were mainly how how things were ran and by whom, right? The collective, quotation marks, the collective, in this case, the Bolsheviks. And then the Nazi Party, if we would have looked in Germany, or the Mussolini and his party, the fascists. But fascism specifically talked more heavily about sense of duty to nation and national identity. I think that was a lot more specific and detailed than what communism had to say about the individual or the proletariat, the factory worker. So the Italians might have birthed it, and I think I've said this before, but the Nazis and the Nazis in Germany really ran with fascism and perfected, I guess, if you could perfect a system of autocracy and rule, they really ran with it. And the people bought in much more. The Nazi Party were able to convert a lot of people to buying into the vision that Hitler was putting forth. And Mussolini just was not able to garner that energy from the people, arguably. So
Italians are a different cultural people than the Germans are, and they had different cultural pressures. Do you recall what Nazi the Nazis? Do you remember? Do you recall what the Nazi? It's an acronym for something. Do you recall what it means?
Oh God. National something.
Mhm.
It's national. God, I remembered this at some point, but I don't. Help me out.
Uh, I I served in Germany for a couple of years, and one of the one of the first words that came into my lexicon living there was Arbeit, which is the German word for work, for labor. So the Nazi Party is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and sometimes it's abbreviated as NSDAP. So National Socialist Deutsche Arbeitsparty.
Hmm.
So what's interesting about the name Nazi, I'm going to keep saying it like Churchill today.
It's throwing me off because our dog is
Nazis.
Nazanin, and so her short form name is Nazi, or
Yeah,
Nazi, but that's Persian, Farsi. So yeah.
yeah. None of the, you know, that's that's going to be that's always a conversation starter for you, I assume, with the dog park when you're shouting for Nazi.
No, it's Nazi, and you just I just call her Naz. It's easier. So,
There you
but yeah,
go. So what's interesting about that structure is that that is the stack of pancakes that Hitler was assembling. That's a terrible metaphor. What do I want here? It's the amalgam of things that he was sticking together to capture as many different spheres of interest as he developed from his nascent state as a veteran of World War One, and as a remaining as a member of the military, but in their propaganda corps.
yeah.
So he hits it off early on in propaganda, and it's discovered through this that he really has a knack for he has the gift of gab, as they say. And so in that post-war era in Germany, the movement for a socialist democratic nation was pretty rampant. I mean, there was a lot of people thinking about how Germany could be some kind of German version of German communist country. Like they were people that were really enthusiastic about developing a country around the workers' union and protecting labor and so forth. And
Yeah.
when I lived there, the labor union was so the labor unions, or rather the organized labor in Germany, was so highly developed as a part of their civilization that if you went to the German version of Home Depot, you guys are going to love this. It was called Bauhaus.
Nice.
because that's Bau is literally like it's used in it's the root word for builder or for farm or that kind of thing. So
Okay,
um
that's
so
funny.
Bauhaus is
Going to
the
the builder
Ger-
house.
it's, there you go. It's a German Home Depot. You can't really buy the caliber of tools that you could buy at a Home Depot in the United States.
Hmm.
And it's because there are labor protections on the sale of those types of tools. Like you can't go and buy professional woodworking tools from a retail store. You have to have some reason
Oh,
why
you need
you're
to be in
investing in this.
that. You need to be in the that union for wood. Like
Yeah,
otherwise, you could be going against. Wow, that's insane
yeah.
protection. Wow.
So
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 even
my
like you'd
cousin,
have to have your own like. Would you have to go to the government to get a permit to do woodwork if you're just doing it on for yourself, like as a
yeah,
hobby or something, or
it,
doing work on your house?
it has to be validated by a those structures, and I couldn't describe them,
Wow.
but it has to be validated by those internal structures in Germany to ensure that you are not displacing organized labor. It's that big of
Wow.
a deal in the country. Even in like I was there in 2002, it was still like that. If it's changed since then, I don't know, but it was definitely an issue for the keep in mind that Germany industrialized really fast in the 19th century.
Yeah.
It only was a country and it only became a consolidated country at the end of the 19th century. And during this period of time, it was industrializing as well. That is to say that the different duchies and cities that ultimately were mashed together to become Germany had all this industry in it. There was this movement for labor protection, and we talked about Marx and Engels and how those are German thinkers on labor.
Yeah.
And so when we consider this role that labor protection has and organized labor has in Germany, if you're going to try to start some stuff in Germany, you probably want to appeal to the Arbeits Party. You want to appeal to the workers' union. You want to um, you want to
Yeah, so he
bring them
was he
into
was
your
trying to
fold.
grab. I see the acronym was there to just grab as many of the coalition. Yeah, well, I was curious about that because the Nazi Party wins some seats in what 1931. They win, and then within 6 months they're one party. How did that go about exactly? Are you familiar with that portion?
To the extent that I can muddle through it, I don't remember the. I think, and we've made the overture several times. Don't look to us for accurate historical facts because we gloss over the dates and years that this was
Yeah.
happening. But this is going on in the late 20s and into the early 30s. So let's do this. Let's do a. I'm going to do a quick search for Reichstag. Reichstag fire. Spelled it way wrong.
As an
Okay.
aside, while you're doing a little searching, one thing I went through an FDR rabbit hole, and I thought one thing that was so funny about FDR and Churchill was that they both had so much connection early on to navies, and they were fanatical about naval warfare power. Both of these men who would go on to be the leaders of the Western Front to um, the the axis of evil that Churchill in his youth and both FDR were in charge of bolstering the Navy. Like the chance of this being the case that these two men would end up, you know, coalescing to defeat Nazi Germany and the Japanese, I just thought, wow, what are the odds that was their start, and just such an interesting little moment. And both of them were so forceful when it came to the Navy too. It wasn't like this was something that they died on this hill. Like Churchill was denied over and over again in his early years wanting to advance the Navy. He kept getting turned down on funding. He was like, no, we need more warships. We need this, oil, blah, blah, blah. Like the Germans, we have to, the Germans are going to industrialize. They're going to figure this out really quickly. And similarly, before World War I, FDR was bolstering the Navy at the time. And then, Wilson was, going to be reelected, hopefully. And FDR, he was just like, I hope Wilson gets reelected because there's more work to be done for the Navy. Like, this was his big thing. So anyways, just as an aside, I thought this was interesting because we're talking World War II and that era.
It turns out the Navy plays an extraordinarily important role in the history that unfolds before us. As we're talking about this, we are going to come back over and over again. We are Army vets.
Yeah.
We did not serve in the Navy, and we will come back over and over again and talk significance and importance and its determinate nature. Churchill was the minister of the Admiralty. I forget how
he was
this.
he's minister to the admiral of the Navy or something like that. But basically, it was like the defense secretary of the Navy, I guess.
Yeah,
like, if that could be a thing. But yeah,
and was the main proponent for Great Britain switching over the boiler systems in British naval ships from coal to oil.
Yep.
It was an obvious transition. This is what you want to do. Coal is awful to work with when it comes to logistics, but oil, are you kidding me? You just pump it in. It's great. And that dictated and motivated it, shall we say, put the wind in their sails to then go to look for places in the world that had oil and colonize them. And it sets up the story for what we talk about later in history, where why are we doing these wars in the Middle East? What's going on? Why is this important to us? We have our own oil. No, the Brits didn't. And it is this whole embroilment of empire, world wars, and nation states trying to protect themselves and secure these resources.
Well, and I should say, I mean, they fought him. It was you say it was an obvious transition to Churchill and the people who knew to him.
Yeah.
Yes. But he had to fight tooth and nail the Brits on this because, first off, they were on coal,
Yes.
The UK had access to coal and they didn't have oil. So so you're telling them, and the same thing that the Germans were realizing is like, hey, we're on coal, but we don't have access to oil, and don't get me wrong, Hitler was trying to synthesize oil from coal. I mean, that was something that they were developing.
They were successful.
Yeah, no, they were successful. I mean, but the West was bombing the shit out of these refineries over and over again. So they successfully were able to do it, but not at the scale with which Hitler needed to for his expansion, obviously. But yeah, so I mean, this is really fascinating. This transition and the fight to transition from coal to oil and that need that Churchill foresaw early on, despite the technological and logistical disadvantage it put the UK in. Very fascinating stuff. Anyways, let's get back to Nazi taking over all the other parties in Germany.
Reichstag, I spelled it totally wrong because
not German.
I'm not German. Well, not in my language. I mean, there's a little history there. Okay, so the Alsace-Lorraine, the Ellises poked their heads out of there. The Reichstag fire. The Reichstag fire was an arson attack on the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament in Berlin, on Monday, 27 February 1933, precisely 4 weeks after Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. So this Marinus von der Lubbe, a Dutch council communist, was the alleged culprit, to which the Nazis attributed the fire to communist agitators. Remember what we said about how their communism was a movement that was afoot throughout the 1920s in Germany.
Sure.
And it was antithetical to Hitler's version of autocracy.
Yeah.
Couldn't tolerate it, but incorporated into the name of his party for sure to get votes and to he, by the way, we've glossed over the Bierstube Putsch, the beer hall coup, the hostile takeover.
Yeah,
we haven't talked about that yet. Hitler was jailed for it, but he attempted to do this earlier in the 1920s, a hostile takeover, and was thwarted because it wasn't going to work for any number of reasons. The
Well,
Germans
he
weren't going to
hadn't
tolerate
there.
this.
He hadn't propaganda. The network of propaganda was just not mature at that
Right.
moment, if I'm remembering correctly. And frankly, a lot happened while he was in jail that where
Yes.
the Nazis were able to gain a lot of popularity while he was
Yes.
gone. So by the time he was chancellor, the Nazi Party had already taken over all the other houses of parliament. Right? That was like
Yep.
a couple years prior, if I'm remembering correctly.
So Hitler used the Reichstag fire. This is a fire that burns down the building of the German parliament. This is like, think of any one of our, important government
If
buildings
January
in
6th, if they had burned down the congressional house floor, yeah, that's
this would
basically
have
what it
been
would
the
have been.
same thing.
Yeah,
And of course, we the whole thing is suspect from a historical perspective. The whole thing is suspect as being set up by the Nazis. They
yeah.
were not above this type of thing, but they got a
Hello,
stooge.
Poland.
They got a stooge. This poor this I'm going to call him this poor Dutch communist. Anyway, they got the stooge, this Dutch communist, to take the fall for it. And so Hitler then used it as a pretext to claim that the communists were plotting against the German government and induced President Paul von Hindenburg to issue the Reichstag fire decree suspending civil liberties. Now, the Germans had been a democracy. The Weimar Republic had been a democracy. This is why the German people are such an interesting study in history and in government, because they went through significant changes in their government systems throughout the 20th century.
Well, yeah, because they were a democracy that during World War One became an autocracy, right? Because
well, so I don't remember exactly how the Kaiser's government was set up, but the Kaiser is a king.
Yeah,
He's an emperor.
He took complete control when
Yeah.
he didn't want to give up power when the Germans wanted to basically to surrender, right?
Yeah. So he was ousted, and this Weimar government takes over after World War One. There's a lot of chaos. I mean, we could spend months talking about just the post World War One chaos.
Yeah.
And when I asked you earlier, like what things led to the beginning of what things led to World War Two, essentially it's the confluence of post World War One indemnity that Germany was put into.
Yes.
And it was, understood by the German military throughout. Germany never lost the war militarily. They lost the will to fight as a nation, and they believe that loss of will to fight was a stab in the back. People will talk about the myth of the stab in the back. They needed people to blame for it. I think we're going to get into who they blamed for it.
Yes.
Pretty soon here. And so part of how you get from Hitler being imprisoned after the coup, the Germans called it putsch, the failed putsch, to Hitler being in jail, to Hitler publishing his struggle, Mein Kampf, to the Nazi Party having all this elected efficacy. They're participating in elections. They're participating in this democratic government. To then the Reichstag fire. And the Reichstag fire is significant and very important in all of this, because it's one of these things where we're totally dubious about it being some communist that set it on fire. Communists were a problem to the Nazis. They needed to be framed and taken down as internal
terrorist.
They were internally terrorizing the nation.
Sure.
And when we talk about suspending civil liberties, so pursue a ruthless confrontation with the communists. This made the fire pivotal in the establishment of Nazi Germany. So when we've kind of brought all these different ideas together. We talked about the fascism, talked about the just embarrassing end of World War I to the German people.
Yeah.
We talk about Hitler having a role in the German military during one. He was injured by a gas attack. There's this whole post-war career that he has where he remains an active duty service member, but he's put into the propaganda arm of the German military. There's a lot of internal strife in Germany because there's all these people that didn't mind having a Kaiser. They wanted that power structure to be in place. It went away. Now they're a social democracy. This is awful to some people's minds. And in an effort to, um, I mean, they're really shackled with a lot of financial
I was
burden
about to
during the
say, yeah, this is
1920s.
just, yeah, a country is feeling the burden of a financial debt that is insurmountable and leads to despair that trickles, I mean, is trickle down economic woes, right?
Yeah,
Not to mention, I mean, the amount of death the Germans experienced through World War One, and like
they lost a generation of people. They lost
yeah,
a
the
generation of
entire
people.
generation, millions and millions of people. So like these had long lasting effects.
Yeah.
All the countries were experiencing those similar effects, but the Germans were also on top of that being laden with the burden of having to pay all of it back. And so it was a perfect tinderbox for people who are disaffected. They feel wrong. They feel like they were, misproportionately blamed for everything. Which it doesn't help if the Ottoman Empire, completely collapses due to this. So like you can't blame them anymore because they don't exist as a country anymore. It's been broken up into a bunch of different. What's left of it has become Turkey and a couple other countries, and then the Austrians similarly, the
Yeah.
Austro-Hungarian Empire also collapsed. So really, what you were
Hmm.
left with was a German country which did bear the brunt of the blame.
Yeah.
Um, and Russia collapses, so they don't get any of the blame at the time, right, for any of their shenanigans. And um, so you had a confluence of events that had burdened Germany with an insurmountable debt that led to the situation, the political climate that allowed for the Nazi Party to gain seats and then inevitably gain complete control, and then use a terrorist event to, you know, take away freedoms and exact authoritarian rule. And
Let
once
me
you've
let me
done
read this.
that, yeah,
Totally. Let me read this little bit from Wikipedia. This is
sure.
from the Nazi Germany page. When the stock market of the United States crashed in 1929, the effect in Germany was dire. Millions were thrown out of work and several major banks collapsed. Hitler and the Nazis prepared to take advantage of the emergency to gain support for their party. They promised to strengthen the economy and provide jobs. Many voters decided the Nazi Party was capable of restoring order, quelling civil unrest, and improving Germany's international reputation. After the federal election of 1932, the party was the largest in the Reichstag, holding 230 seats with a 37.4% the popular vote. Okay, so it's pivotal in history. It's pivotal in our history that the 1929 stock market crash set things in motion worldwide that would be the conflagration that was World War II. And it's important that we keep this in mind. There's so many things going on in the world. It's we're juggling chainsaws, bowling balls, and there's so many things to think about at this post-war era of World War One that really what had been set into place at the end of the war because of this humiliating treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, this
Mm-hmm.
humiliated the Germans. It there are complexities here that we're just not going to get into today, but it had to do with remind me of the president's name at the time. I had it for a second and it went
Well,
away.
Wilson or
Um,
after Wilson?
no, Wilson. Um, the things that we were going to accomplish out of this amazing new world that we were going to perpetuate,
The League
and
of Nations,
yes,
that was Wilson's idea,
yeah,
which eventually became the United Nations. I mean, FDR, look, the great thing, and Wilson really inherited the shit sandwich, which was the World War. I mean, sadly.
mm-hmm,
I would curious to see what his presidency would have been in not a time. I don't know if he handled World War One well overall or not. I just know that FDR, if he had chosen FDR, he probably was a pretty bright guy because he understood that FDR was bright, and putting him in charge of the Navy and then expanding his control alone. And then FDR being a huge fan of Wilson and implementing some of the things that I don't think Wilson ever got to enact shows that maybe Wilson was he had some ideas. He had a decent vision for some things that he wanted to implement that he wasn't able to.
Wilson is a complicated character. He dies in 1904 after being ill at the end of World War One, and he was unable to get our Congress to ratify our role in the League of Nations, which undermined it entirely. Had we participated in the League of Nations, had we not, isolationists, I'll just use that terminology, things might have turned out differently. Things were turning out okay, I guess, kind of, but they were on shaky ground because the United States, as a economic entity, was participating in loans to Germany to help ease some of the economic crisis that was going on. There was a Deutschmark devaluation that took place during this period of time in Germany.
There was a lot of deregulation of our banks, and our institutions were kind of took a back seat. Much of what had happened before Wilson, and why Roosevelt had wanted to get back into the fray in the 1908 election, I believe, or was it 1912? One of those two. Is around that period of time. Roosevelt wanted to get back in because
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt, yes. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to get back in because Standard Oil was starting to consolidate. And after we had created some antitrust laws and we had broken up big oil, the next couple of presidents kind of deregulated and undid some of those regulations that were in place to kind of allow for the market to remain free. Roosevelt had wanted to get back in. He jacked up that election. There's a long story there of why it created a situation in which he didn't get elected. But the trend line for deregulation continued through the 20s in America. And this led to relaxed financial standards by the banks. And we've done this before. We've been there before. Anyone who's listening to this podcast and is an adult lived through the 2008 financial crisis, so they understand what happens when things get deregulated over time and relaxed. This was one of those situations that was happening in the 20s. The fact that we didn't get to ratify ourselves into the League of Nations, we had the economic woes. And because of that, that led to us becoming highly populist. And therefore, we led to this powder box of financial woes that other countries were experiencing, specifically the Germans. And at the same time, we abandoned the world geopolitically because we have too many problems we have to solve. And I mean, that was the way FDR understood that. I mean, FDR had a lot of work to do, and he understood that. And it was a ton of work that had to be home. So we were experiencing tons of financial woes ourselves at the same time, but we just hadn't had the burden of World War I laid upon us like it was laid upon the European countries and more specifically the Germans. So
yeah. All right. So we've kind of sped through some of these ideas about what the I'm forgetting names are escaping me today. I'm having one of those moments where I quoted it, so we might come around to it, but there was an important figure in history who looked at the armistice following World War I and said, "This is not the end of the war. This is just a 20-year ceasefire." And he was right by 67 days. So World War II was inevitable. It was inevitable because of the way that World War I came to a close. The ceasefire happened because of the armistice, because of the way that the Allies looked at Germany and said, they caused this war. Let's put the burden, the
We'll put the blame squarely and flatly on Germany, and they took the
Indemnify.
brunt of the brunt
Yeah,
of the blame. Yes.
the word that was right there that it went away was indemnity. So
Yes.
war indemnity is a historic concept in war and conflict, where the victor indemnifies the loser and makes them pay for things. And so this is what the Allies of World War did to Germany. And as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of the dissolution of their um, the political system, as a dissolution of the value of their money, as all these consequences that happened to Germany, that it set the nation up for a real crisis. When we went into financial crisis in 1929, the world went into a world crisis in
Yeah.
1929, and Germany experienced that. And so the radicalization of these people who were angry about World War One and displacing the blame within their nation onto somebody,
Yeah.
we know who, they were well positioned for this new financial crisis to happen because it gave them greater power and authority. Then we go ahead and have this Reichstag fire where we can blame it on one of the internal enemies. It's game on. It's game on and it's game over.
Yeah.
It's game over for people that relied on civil liberties to have safety within that nation, and it's game on for the people who remove civil liberties and put and raise to the power of a god one dude and one guy in the person of Adolf Hitler, who required total loyalty to him, not to a constitution, not to a government on paper. No, the man Adolf Hitler had to be. And this is one of the reasons why when Pearson and I make these observations about certain modern political candidates and how they require loyalty to them, this is where we're looking at. We're looking at the historical uh, these people who have already done it. We have a
Yeah.
precedent for this.
Magnanimous figures. We have precedent for this. It's why the argument, the obtuse argument against Trump being labeled as a fascist is like, well, he hasn't killed 12 million people yet. He hasn't killed 6 million Jews. And this is, I hear this. These are people online who make these arguments. Pierce Morgan, for the love of God, makes this silly argument where he's all like, you're calling Trump Hitler. He hasn't killed this many million people. And it's like, well, being such a fan of Churchill, Mr. Morgan, you should understand the reference to Hitler is not just in what he's done or what his output was. It was who he was as a person and what he demanded. Like Lenin also, we could say Lenin and Hitler had lots of common similarities to each other, even though one was fighting for communist autocracy. Lenin needed absolute loyalty to his ideas, right? And 100% execution to the word. So we could say they were both the same, but I could also say Lenin didn't kill blah, blah, blah million people. He didn't. He did get quite a few people killed within his short tenure in power. So yeah, these examples they're there so that you can get a window into what historical figures were like and why history can seem as though it's a wheel with new actors and new players, but they're reading old scripts that have been written before, and they're playing out a new version of that story. Donald Trump does require absolute loyalty. He demands absolute loyalty to him, and we've seen this. If you're a sycophant for him, he likes you, and it's as simple as that.
So I just pulled up the Kristallnacht. It's not spelled the way I thought it was either.
Okay. Nocht.
No, it's spelled Kristallnacht.
Oh my God.
So
way
Nacht.
off.
Yeah. So Kristallnacht took place in 1938. So this is what, 5 years after the total consolidation of power?
Mm-hmm.
And 5 years is sometimes a long time, depending on how you're experiencing it. Sometimes 5 years is a short amount of time. But in the context of history, yes, Hitler had not done these things early in the campaign, early in the Nazi campaign, they accumulated into Kristallnacht, and then it was really, really game over for who was um, is it Romani? They called them gypsies.
Yeah.
Anyone who was homosexual, anyone who rumored to
Disabled.
be
Yeah.
any of these qualifications.
Yeah.
And this is the emergence of our sort of basic understanding of what the Nazis called the Aryan, the pure Aryan German citizen, the pure Aryan German.
Which they stole from the Persians. The idea of Aryan race and Aryan people, unironically, is all stolen from Persia. But
if you really dive into the Nazi regime, you're going to see a lot of cultural appropriation. One of the things they appropriated was the swastika, which Norse, Sweden. I think it was from Sweden. I want to say it's a Scandinavian historical artifact. Like it's an imagery from Sweden, is what I recall. I'm probably getting it.
yeah, he didn't take it from the Buddhist monks. I don't believe he wasn't
No.
jacking that from East Asian culture. But yeah,
and there's a great deal of the uniforms about the uniforms and the color palette, and there's all these different interesting things that are totally fabricated. I mean, the propaganda machine in Nazi Germany is epic. It's epic and historic and iconic and all those things that we remember about it. And it was totally manufactured. It's made up crap, but it was a story that the German people wanted to hear.
Well, I feel like there's a lot of similarities now. It's funny. I was listening to someone who was saying is like the manufacturing engine now, it used to just be, like the Russians, but now it's the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Christo-fascists here in America. And then if you've, the news agencies have hijacked enough people's brains, you've got enough willing participants who are actively just spreading the propaganda themselves now. And so there's a lot of confluent forces. I would argue the propaganda machine has definitely evolved in different ways. And we're seeing a new iteration just now than we even saw in 2016, 10 years, a decade ago. The propaganda engine has definitely changed. It's become more complex, more nuanced in some ways, and more obvious in other ways, actually, too, as we've noticed recently. So, yeah, I love that we're getting into this, and it looks like we've reached the end of our timer.
I mean, I think if I'm to share your experience here, the topic is awful. I hate the topic. Yeah. It's the worst thing in the world. But to know about it and to know, let's not even try to be people who just remember names and dates of things that took place. That's hard to do. But to know that generally what happened was a humiliating treaty at the end of World War One, a lot of financial stress throughout the 20s. This is for the Germans, speaking of specifically.
Yeah.
And then the situation of the 1929 stock market, which I grew up thinking was a phenomenon that really only affected our country. No, it was a global consequence.
That's an indictment of our history, our historical education.
There was the inward focus. So our country inwardly focused a lot, isolated. Meanwhile, back in Germany, we've got this putsch goes on. This guy is in prison. He writes a book. Next thing you know, the Reichstag fire in 1933. He's already the chancellor, consolidates power. Now you've got your Adolf Hitler that history remembers as dictator of Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And so with that setup, we have part of this major and colossal answer to, well, what caused World War II? And it's people trying to work out a new way to operate with all of these stressors and all of these historical pressures going on and all swirling ideas that are new and scientific. I mean, that's an undercurrent here that we'll get to later for sure.
For sure.
And so I think this brings us kind of to the end. We could basically say, all right, so 1939 is where we'll pick up next, because 1939 is where the Blitzkrieg takes place. in Poland.
Yeah, and I think the fire that we've talked about today is a good precursor for some dog whistles that Germany creates propaganda-wise within Poland. And that will tie back around to some recent interviews that Putin has had this year. So we can tie that to modern history and why this all matters right now as well. So with that, Richard, it's been a pleasure talking to you as always.
Likewise.
Until next time.
All right. Signing off.
Cheers.